Hey, I'm Kristy,
And I'm Stephanie.
and welcome back to another parent-teacher conference where we believe that conversations about our kids shouldn't just happen once or twice a year. They should be an ongoing dialogue.
Today, we continue our dialogue on human potential, which for us means bringing a child's innermost desires into full expression while fostering a deep connection and harmony with themselves and others. In our last episode, we explored the environmental conditions within our school system, identifying the barriers that can hinder a child's path towards self-actualization. We return to these central questions from a new perspective, looking beyond the school system. What happens outside of schools shapes how we show up within it each and every single day. In having these conversations, we gain valuable perspective and open the door to meaningful partnerships with those who care just as deeply about the future of our children.
Our guest today is a Hall of Famer in the world of human rights. Through her research and advocacy, she invites us to reframe our thinking and confront the systemic barriers that limit human potential. She is the founder and CEO of Children First Canada, with over 20 years of experience advocating for child safety on the global stage. From the halls of the United Nations to national government boardrooms, she has shaped major policy and led global campaigns that have impacted millions of children. She is a member of the top 100 Most Powerful Women Hall of Fame and holds an Oxford degree in international human rights law. She's the woman who helped give children a voice, holding their governments accountable, and she's currently leading the charge to make Canada the safest place in the world for kids to grow up. We are so pleased to introduce to our listeners today, Sara Austin. Sara, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be having this conversation with you today.
So, Sara, I just wanted to start off by asking you if you can share a little bit about your work as the CEO of Children First Canada and maybe some pivotal moments that led you down this path.
Well, it's been quite the ride. I can tell you all the reasons why not to start a new charity. This Canada has many amazing charities particularly that serve and support children and youth. But I really saw a gap in the charitable sector, an important need to be filled, really, when it comes to defending the rights of children from coast to coast to coast and ensuring that their voices are heard in decisions that affect their lives. I worked for nearly 20 years at the global stage in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and at the United Nations, defending the rights of the world's most vulnerable children. When I started my career in the late 90s, Canada was a top 10 country for children. We were world leaders and we had a lot to be proud of. But over the years, I saw Canada falling further and further behind when it came to ensuring that our kids had what they needed to survive and thrive and protecting their fundamental rights to childhood. It dismayed me to no end when I, first had been really proud to be Canadian and, really proud of what we were doing to support our kids. But I saw that gradually being eroded and a disconnect. When I'd come back from being abroad, Canadians would say, "You must be so proud to be Canadian." I could no longer say that, to know that Canada had fallen to, at the time, I think, to 17th place amongst OECD countries. And now we rank 19th amongst wealthy nations for children's well-being and sadly 67th on the Global Kids' Rights Index. It's shocking to hear that. I'm a parent. My son is a teenager now, but when I was first getting this organization started, it was really disturbing to think, my child deserves a good life, and every child, should be able to have the care and support they need to survive and thrive. And that wasn't the case. It still isn't the case. And so I brought together leading children's charities, kids' hospitals, major research institutions, major corporations that invest in kids, and importantly, children and youth themselves, to really unite our country around a vision to make this the best place for kids to grow up. Over the past decade, we've made some huge progress. We've helped achieve things like the establishment of a national school food program, feeding millions of kids across this country. Up until last year, Canada was the only G7 country that didn't have a school food program, and that was an important gap to be filled. And we're really proud that children and youth from our movement have helped make that possible, and that they work together with members of parliament and the prime minister to do that and see a $1 billion investment made in school food. That's a huge win for kids, but we know we have so far to go. And so we're really, particularly right now, focused on online safety and making, I think, hopefully achieving another big win for children, youth, and parents.
Thank you. It takes a special person to notice the gaps that exist, but also to do something about it. So thank you so much for the work that you're doing. And I think you've kind of alluded to this already, but just to, zero in on this a little bit, what is your personal why for this work? I know you talked about your son a little bit and things that you were sensitive to, but what makes you show up for this work with such conviction every single day?
Yeah, it's a lovely question. I was raised as a little girl to have big dreams and bold ambitions. I'm really fortunate to have been raised in a family where my voice was heard. It's, my parents aren't perfect, they would admit that themselves, but I was raised in a family where, my parents did their best for me, but they also taught me as a young person that I had a role to play in it. And we all have a role to play as a society in ensuring the safety and security of children, ensuring that kids are seen, heard, and empowered. And so from my very earliest days as a little girl, I was engaged in volunteerism and fundraising and advocacy and really making change within my community, within my school, and holding government leaders accountable and really advocating for the rights of children. I'm now a parent. I've navigated real challenges in the healthcare system and within education. And, if I'm a parent who is a professional advocate who's gone all the way to the United Nations advocating for kids, struggle to ensure that my own child has the supports he needs, I think particularly of other parents who have significant hurdles to face, whether it's because of their economic circumstances, their mental health challenges. We could go on and on. A child's survival and development shouldn't be determined by their postal code or by their parents' resources. Of course, parents have really the most important role to play in raising their children, but they can't do it alone. We all know the reason, the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, but I believe it takes a nation to raise a nation. Canada has to raise our children. And we talk about raising Canada and raising our kids well. And really that's the vision behind Children First Canada, is to unite every Canadian around the shared vision of helping all of our kids survive and thrive.
Well said. Thank you.
Sarah, you talk about where Canada ranks internationally and how much that really doesn't align with maybe the way that Canadians view themselves or the sense that we have about the nation we're raising our children in. So in Canada, there seems to be, at least from our lens, I think as teachers, as parents, a disconnect between the perception of safety and that reality. Can you speak to some of the greatest threats to child safety within Canada today?
Yeah, I can certainly say when we first started Children First Canada a decade ago, we talk about making Canada the best place in the world for kids to grow up. And people would say, but aren't we already? So, initially there was a lot of myth busting that had to happen. But I think, circumstances have really changed in recent years, whether it's the pandemic and the impacts of lockdowns and school closures and the huge impact that had on children's mental health, delays to education, and simple things like vaccine preventable illnesses and things like that have changed quite drastically. We've seen, I think it's become much more deeply personal. Parents from all different walks of life have seen our kids really struggle, and we're all doing our best to raise our kids, but feel like we're up against these enormous hurdles. Every year, Children First Canada publishes a report called Raising Canada that talks about the top 10 threats to children. It includes everything from, the things, really the essentials our kids need to have a safe and healthy childhood and things that they have rights to. One of the top 10 threats has been preventable illnesses. We know kids suffer and it's tragically in many cases die from preventable illnesses in our country. Physical activity and play. Far too many of our kids are not getting the physical activity they need for their bodies to be healthy, for their cognitive development. That really has been eroded over time. Climate change is one of the top 10 threats to children. We know that it's not just this future existential threat, that it impacts their day-to-day lives. I live in Calgary, Alberta. I've seen in the past 5 years the impact of wildfire smoke. My son not being able to go out to play in the summertime, for simple things like that affect our children. Access to clean water for Indigenous children in remote communities. One of the emerging trends we've seen, particularly over the past several years, is the emergence of online harms and how that is drastically impacting our children's mental health, but also protection from violence and other ways that their survival is put in jeopardy. And so this report is really meant to sort of highlight the challenges, but most importantly, to point to the solutions we need and to unite our country and mobilize Canadians to hold our government accountable and make sure that we provide the supports our kids so desperately need.
I found the report so interesting, right? Because it really does cover such a broad scope, from things that are as large and international, like you said, as environmental concerns, to things that make their way into a child's bedroom as intimately as on a device behind a closed door. And I think for me as a parent and a teacher, sometimes it feels like these threats are hiding in plain sight. And there's talks and policies around the need to protect them, but I think the day-to-day risk is not always known to parents. One of the things that really comes to mind for me, we have in Ontario a Safe and Accepting Schools arm of the Education Act that's administered through our school boards. And in 2021, they received a mandate to implement anti-trafficking plans and protocols. And I think looking to that and learning about that, it's sometimes is this thing that we have a sense of happening in nations across the world, but it's happening in the forefront of our schools, even amongst our kids, right? And so, yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I think you've articulated it so clearly. These issues are like it's this crisis that's really right in front of our eyes, and yet somehow we're disconnected. I think it speaks to the fact that how overwhelmed parents feel right now. We are struggling often to keep a roof over our kids' head. Put food on the table. We're facing the sense of overwhelm and just trying desperately just to do what we need to do to help our kids day to day. But I think in that overwhelm, sometimes parents lose this connection of what's like the bigger picture of what's happening. This isn't just my child or your child, like this is all of our children. But there's also a disconnect sometimes. I think some of these tragic things couldn't happen to my child. I think we've seen too many kids lost and by suicide related to online harms that those parents would never have imagined those things happening to their children. These were caring parents who were engaged with their kids, who, just things happened so quickly and the harm escalated so fast. And it's put this impossible burden on parents. We can't do this alone. We need support. We need not just the support of our neighbors and our community around us, but we need policymakers working to ensure our kids have the support that they need and that parents have the support that we need to care for our children.
I just have to say that as I hear you talk, your love for children and not just your own, but all comes through. It's kind of like this glue that's bringing together all your experience, your degrees, your expertise. It's like this maternal love that's just wrapping around all the action, all the advocacy that you're doing. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. And I think that there's something powerful about maternal love that, can help to continue to drive this work when women, work together, or even paternal, that paternal love is too, including all parents. But there's something beautiful when working together that can really take things forward in a new way. Because I think even from the womb to, your son is a full adult, there's always this sense of protection, like the earliest states of pregnancy when you're thinking about what am I eating? How am I, carrying what's going on around me? We're constantly in that state of how can I create protection for the purpose of thriving? And the way that you talk about these issues, you're constantly back and forth between, policy, the legalities of things, and maternal love. So thank you.
Thank you. That's very sweet of you to say. I really appreciate that. I think, I think there's this mama bear instinct that, most of us have. We fiercely want to defend and support our children. But I also, within that, think about how do we raise, brave little bear cubs and, help them to be brave. I don't know if you can see this. I've got this beautiful picture that I keep next to my desk it's hard to see it there, but, this mama bear, they're fiercely roaring and defending their baby cub. And here is this little baby cub who's also standing in front of them. And I think this is a mental image that I try and hold in the work that we do at Children First. And I think it's something that we can all do. We all want to be these brave mama bears. And we need more papa bears in this too. And there are some amazing dads who are in the fight and who are doing their best to provide for their children. Of course, I don't mean to undermine that in any way, but how do we be brave mama and papa bears, but also help our kids to be brave cubs and to roar for themselves and for their voices to be heard and for them to be able to defend themselves.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I did want to ask you, so you've advocated at the UN for a law that empowers children to hold their governments accountable. So essentially recognize that accountability is the cornerstone of real change. So given your expertise, and your experiences with this, who should we hold responsible for digital safety in 2026?
That's the big question.
Yeah, right. I know a child's life. We're increasingly on platforms, right, owned by foreign corporations. But where do you think the ultimate responsibility lies when it comes to that?
Yeah, I don't think that there's one person or one institution. I think it's a shared duty. And that's right now, sadly, it's all falling on parents' shoulders. It's really like we're in this impossible fight right now where it's, we're the ones monitoring the devices, setting up the restrictions, being vigilant, having to keep these things in check, and feeling like we're always failing, sadly. So parents, of course, we're the front lines of this. Educators play an important role. They spend the most time with our children every day in a classroom. I know there's an opportunity within schools for educators to be talking about digital safety. Our kids are using devices within the school environment, and there's a vigilance required by educators and school administrators. Importantly, government has an important role to play in this too. Countries like Australia have been making big headlines for their social media ban, but they, along with the UK and the EU, many others have had online safety legislation on the books for years. Canada is dangerously behind our global peers when it comes to online safety. That's why we've made this such a big focus for our advocacy at Children First Canada, is getting a law on the books and having some regulation in place. And I understand, like, there are some parents who are concerned about government regulation, but there's no other aspect of our children's lives that doesn't have regulation. The food our kids eat, the medicine they take, the cars they drive in, the playgrounds they play in, the schools they attend, everything that touches our children's lives has some form of legislation to ensure that those are safe environments or safe products. If there was any other product that is marketed to children that makes our kids sick, that puts them in the hospital, or at worst causes them to die, those products are recalled immediately. They're taken off the market until they can be proven to be safe. That hasn't been the case for online safety. We've had more than 2 decades of trusting big tech to do the right thing, and they have clearly proven themselves untrustworthy. They do have a role to play in product safety, and we've seen some of these big companies taking steps in the right direction. But in many cases, I think a lot of parents have the right to be cynical about that. It's too little, too late. And we've seen decisions now in Los Angeles and New Mexico where companies like Meta and YouTube are being held accountable. It's not lost on me that TikTok and Snapchat and others have been a part of these legal suits and have settled out of court. All these companies, not just the social media ones, but also gaming apps, AI chatbots. We've seen too many tragic cases where these companies have failed children, they failed parents with tragic consequences. And so we need the companies, we need the government, we need parents, we need educators, they need all of us in the fight. And all of us carrying our responsibilities. Kids don't want to be cut off entirely from the digital world. They're digital citizens. Whether they like it or not, they're growing up in a digital world and they need to have access and support, but they expect the parents, they expect the government, they expect the companies to do their part to protect them. The adults have not been doing their job, sadly, and there's just been too many tragic consequences as a result.
It sounds like you're asking us to rewrite the story. In order to rewrite the story, we need many stakeholders to be sharing
Absolutely.
the same message. And thank you for reminding us that it's a communal effort when we're thinking about responsibility.
Yeah, and I think, it's a tricky one because, we think about things like the social media ban. There's been a huge, tidal wave of support from parents across Canada who want to see social media banned. But it's, those things are not easy fixes, and it doesn't take the duty off of companies to still, design with safety in mind. My son is going to be 16 in the fall. I don't want him dumped back into the cesspool of social media that he's not currently. I don't want him just to go back into an environment that's extremely harmful. I want these products designed safely. I want to know that there'll be accountability if harms occur. And we need to make sure that we're looking at this whole environment and that we're not just looking at social media, the whole digital environment our kids are exposed to from birth through their teen years. We need that whole digital space properly regulated and for accountability to happen.
So, Sarah, you're speaking about the importance of leveraging the village, right? And raising children and advocating for these necessary online protections. And I know I came to understand your work through the initiative called Countdown for Kids, which Children First is putting forth to call in Parliament to table and pass an Online Safety Act. Can you summarize for the parents listening who might not be familiar what the act should or does entail and why it would benefit children?
Yeah, an Online Safety Act really is just the basics that our government needs to ensure a safer digital environment. It includes, key things like safety by design. Product safety is essential. We expect any other product being marketed to children and youth to be designed with safety in mind, and particularly with children and youth. So safety by design is an important one. This duty of care, again, to prevent foreseeable harms. We know it's clear that social media has been addictive. There's all kinds of harmful content. So they need to have that accountability for tech to anticipate those harms and prevent it. We've seen too many cases where companies like Meta have foreseen those harms, and instead of avoiding them, they've leaned into them. They've actually deliberately made corporate decisions that profit off of harming our children. And so that's another key piece of this. Having an independent regulator, that's a technical term, but it really just basically means that there's a watchdog, somebody who can actually ensure that companies are held accountable. Countries like Australia have an e-digital commissioner that is monitoring what's happening, that is issuing large, substantial fines to companies that violate the regulations, and really is holding these companies to account and holding their feet to the fire. These are some of the core elements of it, but we want to emphasize that it needs to encompass the full scope of digital harms that our kids are exposed to. So not just social media. It needs to look at gaming apps. It needs to look at chat forums like Discord and WhatsApp. It also needs to encompass AI chatbots. We have seen in very recent days the tragic consequences of OpenAI and its impact on the community of Tumblr Ridge. And we could think of a number of other really awful circumstances where kids have been harmed by AI. So we need to look at this full scope of the digital environment, ensuring it's all regulated, that there's accountability, and that all these companies are designing their products with the safety of our children as a priority.
Maybe you might not use these words, but when I hear you talk about it, it feels like soul work to me, because I think, by calling attention to these different platforms and almost like mapping out the network of their impact, you're creating freedom for children and for people to express themselves and to become and to blossom and to live in a world where they're manipulated, to live in a world where they aren't, again, harmed or hurt, or, they're questioning their self-worth, their identity. So I see this almost as like a work of liberation, a work that allows us to really become who we are, because we don't really realize like how strong the narratives within these platforms are calling our attention to and kind of shaping who we are as people.
Mhm.
Like was a point in time where it was the community or the village that was offering these narratives, and it came through interactions with people in person. And now it's, the design of the platform, it's faceless people that we might encounter online. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Again, it's really powerful. It's really needed. I think every parent, would want someone looking out for their children. And I know I have 2 young boys, one a newborn and another 3-year-old. And as you were saying, like thinking about from birth to, to their teen years and beyond, that we need to be thinking about how children are being impacted at every stage of the game.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we're often right now, like at least in the headlines and some conversations I'm hearing across the country, focused on these teen years where they're obviously the impacts of social media. But we've seen just in recent months the impact of technology in the lives of very young children. I mean, just before the Christmas holidays, AI toys were all the rage. And, there were some, pretty scary stories of happening. Parents buying these toys, with the best of intentions, or, grandparents giving these toys to their kids, thinking that they were like, giving this really cool toy to a kid. These AI toys, telling kids to use knives, to light fires, to engage in, egregious sexual acts. These are it's mind blowing how early our kids are now being impacted by online harms. And we think about the role of tech in schools and gaming apps, so many things that our kids are exposed to. It feels totally daunting and overwhelming for parents to be fighting these things on all fronts. And we just can't be in this alone. Parents need support to ensure this safety, and kids deserve it. Your children are growing up in a very different world than we grew up in. Even the challenges my son faces today are drastically different than it was a decade ago. He was given his first iPad by his grandparents when he was 1, and I didn't have to worry about putting, at the time, and we know more about cognitive development and all of those things. But at the time, I didn't have to worry about him sitting in front of YouTube watching videos. It was Peppa Pig, it was marching bands, it was silly things. It was not harmful. But now young kids are having to worry about AI slop, and kids picking on, selecting videos that look child friendly but are actually completely inappropriate for children. It just changes so quickly and can escalate so fast. And so I think this, it's really requiring this vigilance on the part of parents that is exhausting, but also, it really points to the need that we need this, we need our government to step up. And it's crazy that it's taken so long. I think I speak to mothers like Carol Todd, whose daughter Amanda was the first Canadian teen to die by suicide as a result of online harms. She's been fighting this battle for 10 years now, more than 10 years. What is taking so long? Seems like a no-brainer. If there's one thing that can unite all Canadians, and certainly every member of Parliament, it's the protection of our children. So, enough is enough. Let's get on with it and get it done.
Is there a critical question that you could give to parents that would help them to kind of filter through or vet the technology that they're giving their children?
I don't know this one question per se, but I think one message I really want parents to hear is that it can feel totally overwhelming and daunting right now, but you are not powerless. You have the power to change the game in your home. It's not that you can control all of these things, but you set the rules, and you can change the rules at any time, because we know better, we do better.
Wow.
And so maybe you've been letting your child take their phone or their laptop into their into their bedroom to do their schoolwork or to chat with their friends, but to keep those digital devices out of the bedrooms and in public space, like in the family room or in the kitchen or somewhere that there's a parent nearby, because we know that things are escalating so quickly, particularly when it comes to YouTube videos or AI chatbots. So yeah, you set the rules. You have the power. It's not easy. I know, I've got a teenager. I know that the negotiations but it's like you need to set those fierce boundaries and not apologize for it. Your number one job as a parent is to protect your kids. You shouldn't apologize for that. And come at this from a place of curiosity. Keep the conversation with our young ones all the way through their teen years. Keep those conversations going. Ask them the questions. And I think another important part of this is for our kids to know we are their first place to come when they experience harms. They are going to experience harms, whether it's inappropriate content or cyberbullying or what have you. We don't want our kids hiding these things. They need to come to us. I think so much I hear from kids, they don't want to tell their parents because they're afraid of that knee-jerk reaction. The parents are going to take away the devices. They're going to give them fierce consequences. They're going to be grounded. We have a rule in our home that if my son tells us first, if he's the one to come to us to tell us about something that's happened, there are no fierce consequences. We're not going to take away his device. We're not going to, punish him. I'd rather that he tell me that he made a mistake or something went wrong than to find out months later after things have gone way off the rails. And so I think coming at this with a place of grace, that our kids are, they're human. They're going to make mistakes. I'm an adult. I make mistakes all the time. And we need to set our kids up for success and to know that we as their parents should be their first place that they come when they're in trouble.
Thank you for that wisdom and advice for parents, Sarah. I want to circle back to a sentiment you shared about the frustration that I really identify with, like what is taking so long, right? I think especially for those of us working in schools, we have such a volume of touch points of digital harms or digital impact and how it's shaping our kids, right? With access to, any number of kids in your classroom on a given day, not just your children at home. And so I certainly share that frustration with how policy is moving forward around these things. There's a lot of conversations happening in education about the harms and a real sort of stalemate seemingly playing out between ministry, boards, individual schools. We know as of March of last year, 14 Ontario school boards have initiated legal action against those social media companies. Yet the policy and direction around cell phone use in schools feels really subjective and places a significant burden on teachers to manage. It kind of feels like a holding pattern of schools waiting for stronger legislation and policy while policymakers decide where voter sentiment lies, right? So I'm just wondering, from your lens and your expertise, your experience, what reasonable change in policy can schools and parents look to settle this stalemate?
Yeah, I think, and coming back to this idea that we're not powerless as parents or as educators, like we're citizens and like our voices, our leaders, municipally, provincially, and federally, answer to us. And we've seen that sometimes it just feels like very daunting, and particularly from parents or educators who don't have experience being political per se, like beyond voting, really advocating in a powerful way. But we've seen, particularly in the US, but also other countries, the power of parents and educators and children and youth to drive meaningful change. And, it's hard because policy change can sometimes be very slow, but we've also seen in recent days how governments can act quickly and decisively. Australia, the Prime Minister has spoken very publicly about his decision, having heard about the impact of social media. He heard that he acted quickly, and they got their social media age restrictions in place and have made headlines, rightly so, for fast and meaningful change. But that has come after having an Online Safety Act in place. The fact that Canada has nothing, I think, surprises most Canadians. We would have expected that there be regulation like there is for any other products that our kids are exposed to. And the Liberal government pledged to do this 4 years ago, and we're still waiting for the legislation to happen. We believe that this Online Safety Act is coming sometime this spring, probably by June. But for every day that they delay, kids are being gravely harmed. And we've seen too many tragic cases of that. And so we need them to treat this as the crisis that it is and to move swiftly and get that bill passed. It needs unanimous support. Like, we can't have the Liberals and Conservatives and the Bloc and the NDP, arguing over whose bill is best or technicalities. They need to work together, put the best and brightest minds together and work in Parliament to get this bill passed and get it on the books. Provincially, there's a really important role for better regulation. Provinces like Ontario and Alberta and others have made sweeping changes around the use of phones in schools. But as you've rightly pointed out, there's huge gaps around implementation of that. This idea of having a bell-to-bell approach that, school phones and, devices need to be completely away during the school day, but also that there's a reasonable expectation that if tech is in the school, whether it's a laptop or other technology our kids are using, that's set up. A lot of parents are rightly concerned about the digital privacy of their children, or what the use of AI chatbots in schools, and a whole host of other things that are happening with an education environment, let alone what happens once kids leave the school. And so there's a role for provincial governments, most certainly, around AI regulation in schools, around digital privacy, and this bell-to-bell approach for online, for phones in particular. But we need the federal government to step up and do their part as well. And so all levels of government need to be united around the protection of our children. Parents, children and youth, educators need to get loud and say enough is enough, move faster, this is a crisis. And for them to work with that singular vision of protecting our children.
Message heard and received. I think that goes back to that mama bear piece, that image that you started with, right? It's time to get loud. It's time to initiate that political activism and speak up for our kids.
Yeah. And there's public support. There is a public mandate. I don't know. There's been so many polls in the past recent weeks, let alone months, that have shown Canadians are united around this. There is a majority, 90% of Canadians support an Online Safety Act. They support regulation, even if it means that there are economic consequences, even if it means that it rattles the tech bros in the US and Donald Trump. Even in the face of opposition, Canadians are united around this. We've seen too many horrific situations of our children being harmed. We expect better, and we deserve better.
I want to touch on AI and privacy, Sarah, because one of the things that we often hear as teachers, as I'm a guidance counselor in high school, this fear that if my children aren't learning this technology and if they're not immersed in it, they're going to be left behind. There's this fear of falling behind. And so your work with the UN is focused on the right to a sustainable future for children. Does that include the right to a digital blank slate? What concerns with respect to the massive gravitation towards AI and children's privacy do parents need to think about?
Oh, that's a very big question. No easy answers on this by any means. I think there's a big push right now with organizations across the US and increasingly in Canada to really put the brakes on AI when it comes to children and youth. We're not denying that the AI has a role in the future of our children. Of course it does. Our whole world is immersed in AI, and it's drastically changing the game for the workforce, for education, and we can go on and on. It's helpful in so many ways, and we don't want to deny children and youth that, access to the benefits of AI. But when it comes to the protection of their privacy, and particularly the escalation of harms that can occur within seconds, there's no laughing matter. This is a product that is not safe for our children. And so, there is a movement right now to ban the use of AI in schools across North America, and for the foreseeable future. I think there's the timeline is looking at a period of 4 years, essentially a moratorium. It's not that we stop using AI altogether, but they need to prove that product safety. And there is no proof that it is a safe product right now. A lot of schools are trying to introduce it. In Alberta, there's no regulation around AI in schools. It's just every school or every school board for themselves. And that's a terrifying thing for me as a parent. I'm in discussions with my son's principal about this on a regular basis. And there are just too many risks right now. And I don't want to underscore enough. Our kids are digital citizens. They need to have these tools. But until these products are safe, they shouldn't be using them. It's ludicrous to me that we just let this, it's the Wild West right now. And our kids, their privacy, their protection are paramount. Until these products can be safe, they just simply shouldn't be marketed to our children.
I think as we talk about AI, even just by using the word AI, we drop the word artificial, which is the big, red flag. We're talking about something that's artificial, something that isn't, human driven, and it's going to miss those nuances that are needed by, caring people and educators to help guide children. I think you bring up fantastic points about even just the way you're talking about how you're in constant collaboration with your son's principal, and how those daily dialogues, lead you to come to the conclusion that we need to narrow in and really understand how it is that this artificial intelligence works and what boundaries we want to create for our children.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think because AI is being used in schools so extensively now, the kids are learning about concerns around plagiarism or intellectual property. I think from personal experience, sadly, there's not a discussion around, the privacy of children, but the input that the information, the data that our kids are putting into these chatbots, where does that information get stored? How can it be used? Let alone talking about how AI can be used for harm. If we're normalizing it in schools, it's not surprising that kids are going to go home and use it on their phones and their laptops and in many other ways. At school, they're scaffolded by educators who are supervising that. I would hope, that there's some supervision that's happening and some safety in place. But when they go home, if parents don't know, and many parents sadly don't know how things can escalate too quickly, kids are using this for their mental health supports. They're using it as a companion. I live in Calgary, where just a few months ago, a 17-year-old was arrested for having used AI to create sexual abuse images of 5 other kids, 5 other girls in schools across the community. Like, that really hit home for our community, because you can see, and he used, school book photos. He just took pictures of these girls out of their yearbooks and things that they had posted on social media and exploited them in the most egregious ways. And so we owe it to our children to ensure that we're having these conversations with them, because our kids' lives are on the line. Their protection is so important, and we owe it to them.
I really see the points that you made, Sarah, is reflected in kind of like dissenting viewpoints around technology in schools. And I think what's slowly happening is that there's this catch up that has to occur pedagogically, that you cannot talk about AI in schools and not understand that that's inextricably linked to technology. So it does prompt this, I think, reevaluation of like, what is the place of technology in schools and at what age, right? And to what degree? And I think if we're not separating those two, or if we're not looking at the link between them, then we're not really assessing the risk fulsomely either. The idea that a student has a laptop in front of them and they're not engaging with some form of AI, like we really have to confront that, I think, in order for things to meaningfully protect kids. Sport and extracurriculars are something very near and dear to us as teachers. We view them as vital for children's development and well-being. And Sarah, at the end of March, you shared a response to a report that captured the current state of sport in Canada, and you classified it as a broken system. To give our listeners some context, the report was produced by the Future of Sport in Canada Commission, and it was titled Transforming Sport in Canada, A Time for Action. The report itself addressed a distressing number of abuse and maltreatment cases across a wide spectrum of incidents, including sexual abuse by coaches, athletes subjected to grueling diets, coaches refusing to allow athletes to receive medical care following injuries and forcing them to continue to train and compete, hazing, public humiliation, racism, cyberbullying, and financial exploitation. With such a profound set of challenges, what do you see as necessary for Canadian sports to experience transformational change?
It's a really tough question. Such an important question we all need to be asking, but there sadly are no easy answers on this. I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. Sport, physical activity, and play are essentials to childhood. Like, we think about, it's such an important piece. Play is how our kids, their brains develop, their bodies develop, and sadly, it's been really like, we're seeing this decline in play and physical activity. When our Raising Canada report, and there's all kinds of data that kids are not getting enough of it. But when they do get it, parents should rightly expect that when they put their kids into a program, whether it's a Timbits hockey league or their soccer program, or any other sport that they're exposed to, you would expect that those coaches and volunteers have been trained, are safe adults for our kids to be in the company of, and that we can trust those people to care for our kids. But we have seen time and time again, organizations big and small, all the way up to Hockey Canada and Gymnastics Canada and Alpine Canada and on and on and on. These systems have had systemic abuse where they have covered it up, where they have rewarded the perpetrators, and kids have been tragically failed. And so it really is there's a real push. There has been for many years. And I want to pay tribute particularly to the late Member of Parliament, Kristy Duncan, who was really at the forefront of driving and calling for urgent change at the federal level in Canada. She recently passed away, but she has a huge legacy that needs to be carried on. And Member of Parliament Adam Van Koeverden, who's a former Olympian, certainly has picked up the charge and is running with it. But it really is a system that's broken from the grassroots sports level all the way up to the big institutions. And again, feels like a daunting thing for parents, because we want our kids to get physical activity and play. We want them to be having access to these opportunities. But we have seen too many tragic cases where kids have been exploited in the worst possible ways, and where these systems have covered it up and being able to get away with really egregious harms to children. And so again, it comes back to the need for regulation in this space, for government to be holding these institutions accountable, but where there's an important role for parents to be vigilant. And I don't think any parent wants to be in the situation where you're constantly feeling like you've got to second guess people or have a sense of mistrust for other people. But I think we have to be vigilant. We need to make sure that when we're enrolling our kids in sport or physical activity, that they have policies, that they're following those policies, that their volunteers are trained, and that it's not just a one and done, tick a box, move on kind of situation, that there's this vigilance that is continually in place. My son has been in sports since he was young, and I've volunteered on the board of some of these clubs, and I'm asking the questions about the policies, and when people are recruited, whether it's for volunteer roles or if they're getting paid employment, what are the questions that are being asked? What kind of due diligence is happening? Are we getting vulnerable sector screening checks on these people? Are reference checks being done? And do we always have a two-parent rule or two-adult rule? No kid is being left alone with a single adult. For the sake of the child, let alone for those adults, we need to be vigilant and really ensure that we're doing everything we can and just ensuring the protection of our children from the family to the club sport, all the way up to those upper echelons of these big institutions. And government has a role to play, and government releases a ton of money to these organizations, and there needs to be accountability. We can't just be pouring millions of dollars out the door into institutions that have proven to be untrustworthy and unaccountable.
I teach consent education to teenage boys, and it's one of the reasons that I advocate for it so strongly. I think the love of sport sometimes blinds us to the power differential that exists between coaches and athletes. And if students and parents aren't understanding that power differential, I think that's absolutely where some of those vulnerabilities come into.
Absolutely. And I think, we're hearing more and more about the toxic culture in sport and how it's impacting our kids, and that we as parents need to be vigilant about that, and like what kind of attitudes our daughters and our sons are adopting, and what do we expect of them? We see that this is happening from local clubs all the way up to national institutions that are iconic. We as parents need to be, again, setting the tone for the behavior we expect of our children, what's acceptable in the locker room, let alone when that they're out in the community. So it's just, again, it requires a vigilance that feels totally exhausting, that feels totally daunting, but we owe it to our children to be pushing, to be holding these systems to account, and to be educating and informing our kids with it in the home, within the classroom, and really changing that culture for the better.
So, Sarah, in hearing you speak today, your message has certainly landed with us about, being vigilant, being responsive citizens, parents, but more, even more strongly, the way in which you've communicated this message has landed with me. There's such a sense of urgency. Act now, do something, speak up, take a stance. Why do you think, there isn't that same sense of urgency amongst, I don't know, the nation in general, or amongst parents? Like, why aren't we acting as if someone has just entered the room with the biggest threat possible to our children? Like, as if they're holding a weapon. Like, the way you're responding, it's like someone just came in here with a weapon and I need to protect my child. Why isn't everyone sharing in that at this point in time?
There is this deep sense of overwhelm, and I don't want to undermine that in any way. Like, being a parent is the toughest job, and we are just struggling, whether it's the cost of living or the mental health pressures that we as parents are facing, all those things. It requires so much energy to be engaged on all fronts, whether it's around the sports that our kids are playing or the devices that they're using, all this. It just feels very overwhelming. But I guess we got to wake ourselves up out of that and just get past that inertia, and just feel like, to remember that our kids' lives are on the line. Like, there's nothing that's more, coming back to this message, it's nothing more important than the protection and survival of our children. That's our number one job as parents. And so we've got to wake up out of the malaise and just sort of see this as the crisis that it is. I think it's something that should unite us all, and I think it does unite us all. I think our Canadians care deeply for our children. Parents love their kids. We all want what's best for them, and so this is a wake-up call. And I think if there was ever a moment for change, it's now, where this time has come, particularly when it comes for online harms and bringing an end to this. And so time's up. Let's move on. Let's get it done.
You're a wonderful knowledge keeper of all the harms that have kind of arisen. And, I'm sure you keep the stories of many children and parents in your hearts as you do this work. And I think that gives you, also a sense of urgency to act and to continue to advocate. And parents, maybe sometimes in the overwhelm, as you mentioned, if there isn't an immediate risk and we're just trying to survive the day, they might not be as attuned to, hey, my child was on AI today, nothing happened, and they're sitting at the table with me having dinner. But I think you're a great reminder, because you've seen, you hold these stories and you're able to remind us, as you sprinkled throughout the interview, of the daily moments, the daily interactions can lead to bigger things. Let's wake up, as you said, and your call to action is very clear. So thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think in every other aspect of our lives, we're talking to our kids. We don't let our kids, go out and cross the road without talking to them about street safety. And it's not like we just have this one conversation about, like, this is how you cross a road. Like, parents were always sort of keeping that watchful eye and having conversations about the basics of our kids' safety. And so we just need to treat that as just be mindful of the risks and have those conversations with our kids and do our best to stay on top of it.
Sara, you're a true champion of our children. Thank you so much for conferencing with us today and for sharing your passion for protecting our kids. We will share references to all of the studies mentioned, as well as the relevant links to Sara's very important work in our show notes. Parents, take a small but mighty step today to protect your child and click the link that reads Countdown for Kids. Sign the petition urging our government to advance the Online Safety Act. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next conference.